Okay, so today we're going to go through how to do a kettlebell swing. So the reason we're going to do kettlebell swings is because it's one of those movements where a lot of people you'll see do it in the gym or out and about, and sometimes the techniques they're using aren't quite correct or not necessarily used to doing an efficient movement or doing it properly. So we're just going to go through what it is, how to do it, some common errors, and how you're going to fit into your program like we've done with the other movements. So to start off with what it is. So kettlebell swing is essentially a dynamic hip dominant movement which is good for building aerobic conditioning and strengthening your posterior chain, specifically your hamstrings, your glutes and your lower back, so your erectors. It's good for building strength and power, so it carries over quite well as an athletic movement. It's quite a technical movement, which is why sometimes people make a few mistakes when they're doing it. So if we just go through a demo, the basics that you need to know, and then we'll go through how to avoid some of the more common errors. So we'll just use the kettlebell for a demo. So it's basically an aggressive hip hinge. So what you want to do is go into your neutral stance, grabbing the kettlebell, drive the hips back, push through, keeping a neutral spine. There's a strong hip hinge, driving your hips back, keeping your back nice and flat, pushing through, and then coming back down. That's basically how it's going to look. Main things that you'll see errors on this movement, which you see quite often, is people turning it into a squat. So using it as a squat movement, so that looks like this. So it'll come down and then push up. So just squatting down into it. That's not really the best thing that is for. It's pretty much just hitting that hip hinge pattern that you want to be focusing on. So that's probably the most common area you'll see, is turning into that squat movement. You'll also see people losing their spinal position, losing their back. So you want to keep that flat tabletop back, neutral spine. So you want to be here. Quite often, especially at the bottom, you'll see people come out of position, start to round as they pull through, and then it's getting into not keeping a brace, getting into some awkward positions with their spine. Other common area you'll see is a lack of speed. So it's quite an aggressive, powerful movement, so building up athletic power. Sometimes you'll see people being a little bit too slow, so sort of cutting down, and then turning into an upright raise, which is not being very powerful. So you want to really focus on being aggressive, drive through with the hips, make it into that nice aggressive hip hinge. And you also see people do with their arms things like bringing their arms all the way up, turning into sort of a traps and upper body movement. You're probably better off keeping that separate, doing your upper body training. It's really, your arms are just there for the momentum, carries the kettlebell up, and then you catch it on the way through and then drive through. Your arms aren't really doing much of the work in the movement. So that covers most of the common errors you'll see on kettlebell swings. In terms of programming and adding into your program, so it is a really efficient movement, so it is a good one to include. So it's compound several muscle groups worked, but it's also, as well as strengthening those areas, it's going to work on your aerobic capacity, so cardio, heart and lungs. It's going to improve. You'll notice doing like one set of kettlebell swings, you get out of breath compared to other movements. So depending on what your goals are, if you're doing primarily a strength training program, you probably want to include it at the end of your session just to add towards your volume for your posterior chain. You wouldn't want to include it really before because it might interfere with the movements that you're doing. If you're on a more cardio fitness focused program, you can include it more regularly because it's going to be really good at building the cardio aerobic conditioning as well as strengthening those muscle groups. The hamstrings, the glutes are going to carry over well into any athletic, like running, sports, that kind of thing as well. If that is your goal, to improve on your fitness, then you can include it more regularly than you would in a strength training program. And then just be aware as well that it can be quite fatiguing, especially if you're starting out doing that movement, especially for your lower back, your hamstrings. You can fatigue quite fast, especially if you're doing heavier swings, it's good to include them, but just be aware that if you are doing other movements in the gym, so deadlifts, anything involving lower back, rows, squats, that kind of thing, then it might interfere with your strength on those if you are doing it regularly. So yeah, that will be all we're going to talk about on kettlebell swings.